Welcome back to MadMinds, where we don't just tell stories, we awaken the ones buried in silence. Imagine a world where everything humanity had ever learned, every discovery, every invention, every whisper of the stars and secrets of the soul, was written down, preserved in scrolls so rare, only one copy existed in the entire world. Now imagine all of it, burning, not in an accidental fire, but in deliberate silence. Thousands of texts, lost languages, ancient technologies, and forgotten philosophies erased, not just from shelves, but from memory itself. This was the Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled, a place where minds from across the ancient world came to think, to dream, to wonder. And then, one day, it was gone. No survivors, no last-minute rescues, no backups, just smoke and silence. This isn't a story about fire. It's a story about forgetting, about how easily civilizations can lose everything, not to war, but to neglect, not to enemies, but to ego. This is the story of the night the human race lost part of its soul. And the terrifying truth is, we don't even remember what we lost. Alexandria was never meant to be just a city breathing along Egypt's coast, its lungs filled with Mediterranean salt and desert wind. It was an idea carved from marble dreams and Alexander's impossible ambitions, a place where knowledge itself could take human form, walk through torchlit corridors, and whisper secrets that had traveled from the edges of the known world. Built by the fevered vision of Alexander the Great and brought to trembling life under Ptolemy I, this wasn't merely another conquest marked on blood-stained maps. This wasn't just stone and mortar arranged to house merchants and soldiers. This was a lighthouse built not for ships, but for minds lost in darkness. They called it the Jewel of the Mediterranean, and the name clung to it like incense smoke, earned through decades of drawing the world's wisdom into its hungry embrace. Ships arrived from Greece carrying philosophers who argued with shadows, from Persia with astronomers who had mapped the dance of planets, from India with mathematicians who had learned to count infinity, from lands so distant their names were barely whispers on traders' tongues. But they didn't come only for silk that felt like captured moonlight or spices that burned like concentrated sunsets. They came for something far more precious, far more dangerous, wisdom itself. And towering above the harbor like a stone prayer to knowledge stood the Great Library, nestled within the Mausyan, the Temple of the Muses, where 9 goddesses were said to breathe inspiration into mortal minds. This was no ordinary sanctuary built for gods who demanded sacrifices and submission. This was a temple to reason itself, where the only offerings required were curiosity and the courage to question everything you thought you knew. A house built not of memory alone, but of living truth. Within walls that seemed to pulse with accumulated centuries of human thought, thousands upon thousands of scrolls lined shelves that stretched toward shadows the torchlight could never quite penetrate. Papyrus and parchment, texts looted from conquered cities, bought from desperate scholars, copied by scribes whose hands cramped from transcribing infinity, or stolen in the night by collectors who understood that some treasures are worth any price. The hunger for knowledge here knew no boundaries, no shame. Legend whispers that any ship docking in Alexandria's harbor was searched like a criminal, but not for weapons or contraband, for scrolls. And when found, the originals were claimed by right of intellectual eminent domain, copied by the library's army of scribes, and replicas returned to their owners like consolation prizes for unwittingly feeding the great beast of learning that could never be satisfied. They collected everything with the desperate greed of time running out. Mathematics that could predict eclipses and measure the circumference of Earth, astronomy that mapped the movements of distant suns, medicine that could peer inside living bodies and coax them back from death's threshold, poetry that captured the human heart in verses that still beat centuries later, engineering that defied gravity and common sense, philosophy that dared to ask why existence exists at all. Entire civilizations reduced to ink and preserved like relics of gods who had forgotten their own names. But this wasn't Greek imperialism dressed in scholarly robes. The library's shelves held treasures from Babylon's ziggurat-crowned cities, from Egypt's pyramid-shadowed temples, from India's monsoon-soaked centers of learning, from Persia's fire-tended archives, even whispers and fragments from lost lands that maps no longer remembered, civilizations that had left only their wisdom behind like footprints in sand that refused to be erased by time's wind. Knowledge wasn't segregated here by tribe or tongue or the accidents of birth and geography. It was merged, like rivers flowing together into something larger than their separate sources. It was debated by minds that sparked against each other like flint and steel. It was challenged by those brave enough to doubt their ancestors' certainties. It was rewritten by each generation that inherited it, each scholar adding their voice to a conversation that had been continuing since the first human looked at stars and wondered what they were. Scholars from every corner of the known world gathered under one vast roof, thinkers who had never shared a language finding that they shared something deeper, the hunger to understand, to know, to push against the boundaries of what mortals were supposed to be capable of comprehending. Imagine what that meant. Long before invisible networks could connect minds across continents in the blink of an eye, before machines could reproduce wisdom faster than scribes could think, before nations were anything more than arbitrary lines drawn on parchment by men with swords, there was a single fragile place where the sum of all human thought tried to gather itself into one impossible, beautiful, terrifying whole. The most dangerous experiment in the history of civilization. What happens when you try to know everything? But greatness casts shadows as deep as its light reaches high, and gravity always invites destruction. Because a library that powerful, a place where questions outnumbered answers and truth mattered more than comfort, was never going to be left in peace. Not in a world built on the bones of conquest, where empires rose and fell like seasons, and power always belonged to those willing to destroy rather than create. Not in an age where rulers understood that an educated population is the most dangerous enemy any tyrant will ever face. The more it grew, the more luminous it became, the more it threatened every throne, every altar, every system built on the assumption that some knowledge was too dangerous for ordinary minds to possess. To rulers who preferred subjects to citizens, to religions that demanded faith over questions, to all those who had grown fat and comfortable feeding on ignorance. Because what happens when people stop believing the myths you've spent generations teaching them and start reading the facts you've spent just as long hiding from them? What happens when the light gets bright enough that shadows can no longer hide? They say the library held over 400,000 scrolls at its peak. Some ancient sources claim 700,000. Others whisper numbers even more impossible, collections so vast they strained the imagination of those who tried to catalog infinity. But no one knows for sure, because no one kept a record of what was burned, only that it was, only that something irreplaceable had been feeding flames that would never be satisfied. And in that uncertainty, in that gap where knowledge should be but only silence remains, we glimpse the true horror of what was lost. That's how forgetting begins. Not with a bang, but with the quiet realization that you'll never know what questions you'll never be able to ask. There was no single night when the world's memory died in screaming orange flame, no great conflagration that witnesses could point to with trembling fingers and say, "Here." This is where the light went out forever. This is where humanity's greatest conversation was cut short mid-sentence. The tragedy of the Library of Alexandria wasn't that it burned in one terrible, dramatic moment that poets could capture in epic verse and historians could mark with precision on their timelines. It was that it burned slowly, quietly, in shadows where no one was watching, in whispers where no one was listening, piece by piece, like a body dying of a disease that ate away at vital organs while leaving the skin untouched. Scroll by scroll, as individual works vanished into ash and their absence wasn't noticed until someone went looking for wisdom that was no longer there. Memory by memory, as the great conversation of civilization developed gaps where voices should have been, silences where songs once played, emptiness where light once burned. Some blame Julius Caesar, though Caesar never intended to murder the future. In 48 BCE, During his siege of Alexandria, a military campaign that was supposed to be about politics and power, not the destruction of human heritage, his warships caught fire in the harbor. Ancient sources speak in hushed tones of flames that leaped from wood and canvas to consume the warehouses along the waterfront, spreading like a plague of light through districts where scrolls were stored like grain, waiting for minds hungry enough to harvest them. Did the fire reach the library itself? Did Roman soldiers, drunk on victory and wine, watch ink dissolve into smoke without understanding they were witnessing the death of thoughts that had taken millennia to think? Could they hear, beneath the crackle of burning papyrus, the sound of questions that would never be answered screaming as they died? Or did they mistake the repositories of human wisdom for simple storage rooms, never knowing that each scroll they watched burn contained a piece of eternity? The Romans moved on, as conquerors always do, counting their victories in gold and territory, while remaining blind to the treasures that can't be weighed or measured or divided among soldiers as spoils of war. But Alexandria limped on, wounded but still breathing, its great project of gathering all knowledge into one sacred space, continuing even as the collection grew smaller, more vulnerable, like an old tree losing branches in each storm, but still reaching toward light. Then came the Christians, carrying a different kind of fire, not the accidental flames of war, but the deliberate heat of ideological purification. In the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire had undergone a transformation as complete as caterpillar to butterfly. The pagan pluralistic world of many gods and competing philosophies had been replaced by the singular certainty of one truth, one God, one way of understanding reality that brooked no rivals. And with that transformation came the terrible clarity that accompanies absolute conviction. The old temples became threats to be eliminated, the ancient philosophies poisoned to be purged from the bloodstream of civilization, the accumulated wisdom of centuries' obstacles to be cleared from the path to salvation. The Serapeum, a magnificent daughter library of Alexandria that had grown like a satellite around the gravitational pull of the great collection, fell to a Christian mob whose faith burned hotter than any accidental fire. They came not with torches but with hammers, not seeking to steal but to destroy, driven by the terrifying logic of those who believed they alone possessed truth worth preserving. Statues that had stood for centuries, their marble faces worn smooth by time and touch, shattered under righteous blows. Scrolls that had survived Alexander, Caesar, and the slow erosion of neglect were obliterated by those who saw them not as treasures, but as temptations. Voices of gods no longer welcome in a world that had decided it needed only one divine conversation. Not because the scrolls were dangerous to anyone's physical safety, but because they dared to preserve questions that challenged comfortable certainties, because they whispered that truth might be larger and more complex than any single human understanding could contain. And still, even after the Christians had finished their holy work of forgetting, that wasn't the end. Alexandria's great library was like a dying star. Even as its light faded, it continued to burn with residual heat, continued to attract minds hungry for illumination. In 642 CE, the Muslim conquest of Egypt brought Alexandria under new rule, and once again, the library, or whatever precious fragments still remained of humanity's greatest collection, found itself standing in the path of orthodoxy. Legend speaks of a caliph who applied the ruthless logic of religious certainty to the question of what knowledge deserved to survive. If these books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they contradict it, they are dangerous. So they were burned, used as kindling for the city's bathhouses, fuel to heat water for cleaning bodies, while minds grew dirtier in ignorance. Steam rose from baths warmed by the incinerated dreams of poets, the mathematical proofs of geniuses, the medical observations that might have saved millions of lives. But here's the truth that should haunt every person who has ever opened a book, who has ever wondered about the vastness of what they don't know, who has ever felt the electric thrill of a new idea connecting to an old one. No one really knows when the library died, because no one noticed it bleeding. There was no death certificate signed by history's hand, no final scroll marked the end in the careful script of a librarian who understood they were writing the last words in humanity's greatest conversation. No bell that tolled to mark the moment when the world became significantly smaller, darker, more alone. Just centuries of erosion, of war that consumed books as collateral damage, of faith that saw competing truths as enemies to be eliminated, of fire that ate papyrus and parchment without discrimination, of fear that books might contain ideas too dangerous for ordinary minds to encounter. Until one day, no one knows which day, no one recorded the date, the last shelf stood empty, its wooden arms reaching toward nothing, and no one remained who remembered what treasures it had once cradled. The Library of Alexandria didn't die in a blaze of dramatic martyrdom that would inspire songs and stories for generations to come. It died in neglect. It died in the quiet moments when people stopped caring about preserving what their ancestors had died to protect. It died in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small indifferences. Because the real danger to knowledge, the true enemy of human understanding, isn't dramatic destruction that draws attention and outrage. It isn't the spectacular flames that light up the night sky and wake sleeping neighbors. It's apathy. It's the slow poison of not caring what gets lost. It's the gradual acceptance that some conversations can end mid-sentence without anyone mourning the silence that follows. And that should terrify us more than any fire ever could, because fires eventually burn out, but apathy can smolder forever. They say the worst part of loss isn't what you remember with crystal clarity, the faces and voices that haunt your dreams and follow you through waking hours. It's what you'll never know you forgot. It's the conversations that were cut short before they could change your life. It's the wisdom that died before it could be born in your mind. The Library of Alexandria didn't just contain stories that entertained, or histories that informed, or poems that moved the human heart to tears and laughter. Hidden within those endless corridors of scrolls were secrets, formulas that could have revolutionized medicine centuries before they were finally rediscovered, technologies that might have powered civilizations with clean energy, star charts that mapped cosmic patterns we're still struggling to understand, philosophical insights that could have prevented wars and healed divisions that still bleed across our world, blueprints for a future that would never arrive, maps to treasures that remained forever buried, keys to doors that would stay locked until different hands, in different centuries, learned to forge their own. Among those lost voices was Hypatia, mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, teacher, a woman who dared to think freely in a world that was growing increasingly hostile to free thought. She walked Alexandria's marble halls when they still echoed with scholarly debate rather than the silence of empty spaces. She ran her fingers along scrolls that contained the accumulated wisdom of ages, breathed in the dusty perfume of preserved papyrus, felt the weight of stylus in hand as she added her own insights to humanity's great conversation. They dragged her through Alexandria's streets in 415 CE, her body broken by the hands of those who couldn't tolerate her mind, not because she threatened their physical safety or challenged their political power, not because she commanded armies or controlled treasuries or wielded any weapon more dangerous than questions that made people uncomfortable, but because she threatened their certainty, because she represented the terrifying possibility that truth might be larger than their ability to contain it. Because her very existence proved that knowledge belonged to anyone brave enough to seek it, regardless of gender or religion or the accident of birth. Imagine what vanished with her into the silence that swallowed so much of Alexandria's light, formulas that might have unlocked the secrets of mathematics centuries before other minds rediscovered them through painful, lonely struggle. Astronomical observations that could have guided navigation and prevented countless ships from dying lost in starless nights. Philosophical insights that might have built bridges between cultures instead of walls that still divide us today. Solutions to problems we're still trying to solve. Answers to questions we're still afraid to ask. Truths that died with her and left the world significantly poorer. The works of Aristarchus vanished like smoke on wind. This man who claimed the Earth orbited the Sun nearly 1,700 years before Copernicus would be celebrated for the same insight. Imagine if that knowledge had survived, had been preserved and studied and built upon by generation after generation of minds hungry for cosmic truth. How much earlier might humanity have realized its true place in the universe? How many centuries of geocentric arrogance might have been avoided? How much sooner might we have begun our real exploration of the stars? Instead, the idea died with its scrolls, and humanity spent over a millennium believing it stood at the center of everything. The engineering notes of Hero of Alexandria, who designed steam-powered machines that could have launched an industrial revolution in the first century CE, who created automatic doors and mechanical wonders that seemed like magic to those who witnessed them, all consumed by flames that couldn't distinguish between revolutionary technology and ordinary fuel. Picture those machines, powered by steam and operated by gears that Hero had calculated with mathematical precision. Imagine if those designs had survived, had been refined and improved by centuries of inventors building upon his foundation. The Industrial Revolution might have begun when Rome was still rising, when there was time to develop technology in harmony with wisdom rather than in the rush of profit and competition. Instead, humanity waited over 1,000 more years to rediscover the power that Hero had already harnessed. Medical texts from Egypt that contained treatments refined over millennia of careful observation. From India, where practitioners had mapped the body's subtle energies. From Persia, where physicians had learned to balance elements within human systems. Cures for diseases that we relearned only centuries later through trial and error that cost millions of lives, or treatments we still haven't rediscovered despite all our modern sophistication. How many people died of illnesses that Alexandria's physicians could have cured? How much suffering could have been prevented if those scrolls had survived the flames? Maps that showed lands we hadn't yet discovered, drawn by explorers who had sailed beyond the edges of official knowledge and returned with proof that the world was larger and stranger than anyone dared to imagine. Histories written by peoples we conquered and then erased from our own records. Voices of civilizations that we reduced to footnotes, but who might have taught us different ways of living, different ways of organizing society, different ways of relating to each other and to the natural world that sustains us. Stories that could have shown us we weren't the first to face the challenges that still overwhelm us. Wisdom that could have helped us avoid mistakes we continue to repeat. The dreams of poets whose names were never carved into monuments or remembered in songs, but whose words might have moved human hearts in directions we can't even imagine now. Verses that captured truths about love and loss and hope and fear that could have comforted countless souls through dark nights of the spirit. Stories that could have helped us understand ourselves and each other with deeper compassion. All turned to smoke like breath lost in cold wind, all reduced to ash that scattered on Mediterranean breezes and settled into silence. We didn't just lose information that could have been useful. We didn't just lose facts that could have filled in gaps in our historical timeline. We lost acceleration. We lost momentum. We lost the compound interest of knowledge building upon knowledge, generation after generation. Humanity was climbing a ladder toward understanding, each rung built from insights that previous climbers had achieved through struggle and sacrifice. Each scroll in Alexandria represented not just individual wisdom, but a platform that future minds could stand on to reach higher, see further, understand more deeply. And someone kicked the ladder out from under us, not through malice or calculation, but through the accumulated weight of ignorance, fear, and the simple failure to understand what was being lost. The Renaissance, that explosion of art and science and philosophy that transformed the world, could have come 1,000 years earlier if the scrolls of Alexandria had survived. Electricity might have powered Roman cities. Democratic ideals might have evolved in harmony with imperial organization. Medical advances might have prevented plagues that killed millions. Instead, humanity stumbled through a dark age that didn't have to happen. Instead, we forgot and had to remember, discovered and had to rediscover, invented and had to reinvent. We think of history as linear progression, as steady forward movement, from ignorance toward enlightenment, from primitive to sophisticated, from darkness toward light. But history isn't linear. It's fragile. It spirals and loops back on itself. And sometimes when enough knowledge is lost at once, it bleeds backward. Sometimes entire civilizations have to start over from the beginning. The tragedy of Alexandria isn't just that scrolls burned or that individual works were lost. The tragedy isn't even that specific people died or that particular insights vanished into smoke. The tragedy is that we never knew what Alexandria could have become. We never discovered what humanity could have achieved if that conversation had been allowed to continue. The library wasn't just a building filled with preserved knowledge. It was a timeline. It was a future that could have been, and we burned our way out of it. We chose ignorance over inheritance. We let fear triumph over curiosity, and the price we paid was centuries of darkness that we're still trying to climb out of, still trying to remember, still trying to become. Some wars are fought with bronze swords that drink blood under foreign suns and iron spears that write victory in the language of screaming metal. Others are fought in whispers that travel faster than cavalry and cut deeper than any blade. Others are fought with silence. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria wasn't merely physical destruction. Scrolls reduced to ash, buildings collapsed into rubble, scholars scattered like leaves before storm winds. That would have been tragedy enough, the loss of irreplaceable artifacts and accumulated wisdom. But what happened in Alexandria was something far more sinister, far more complete in its devastation. It was ideological warfare, a war waged not against walls or scrolls or even the scholars who studied them, but against memory itself, against the very idea that some kinds of knowledge were worth preserving. Because memory is the most dangerous weapon ever forged by human consciousness. Memory holds truth when power prefers lies. Memory preserves alternatives when systems demand conformity. Memory whispers that things could be different, better, that the way things are isn't the way things have to remain. And truth, when it's inconvenient, becomes the enemy of every throne, every altar, every system built on the assumption that people are too stupid or weak or corrupt to handle reality. Empires don't fear swords. They can forge more swords, hire more soldiers, build higher walls and stronger gates. They don't fear gold. They can tax more, conquer more, take whatever wealth they need from those too weak to resist. But they fear questions. They fear the moment when subjects become citizens, when obedience becomes inquiry, when people stop accepting what they're told and start thinking for themselves. And the Library of Alexandria was a house built entirely out of questions. Every scroll on every shelf represented some human mind that had looked at the world and asked why, or how, or what if. Every text preserved there was evidence that alternatives existed, that truth was larger and more complex than any single authority could contain or control. Why do we worship the gods we worship instead of the gods our neighbors worship? Where did we come from? And what civilizations rose and fell before us? And what did they learn that we've forgotten? How do we know what we think we know, and what happens when we start questioning the foundations of our certainties? What if the people in power aren't actually smarter or more virtuous or more divinely blessed than the rest of us? What if there are better ways to organize society, better ways to treat each other, better ways to live that we haven't considered because we've been told these questions are too dangerous to ask? The rulers of every generation understood what modern dictators still understand. A scroll can be more explosive than any catapult ever constructed. A single sentence, preserved in ink and passed down through generations like a burning coal that never cools, can unravel entire belief systems that took centuries to weave around the minds of the faithful. Ideas are the most dangerous viruses ever unleashed. Once they infect a mind, they spread to other minds, multiply, mutate, evolve in directions their original authors never intended. Once people start thinking, it becomes impossible to make them stop. So the destroyers of Alexandria didn't just attack the physical scrolls. That would have been crude, temporary, ineffective. Burn a library, and people remember it was burned, ask what was lost, work to recreate what was destroyed. They attacked the idea of the scrolls. They erased the memory that the knowledge had ever existed in the first place. They rewrote history itself. They told new stories that painted the past in different colors. They taught that Alexandria had never been that important, never held that much wisdom, never really mattered in the grand scheme of human development. Maybe the whole thing was exaggerated by nostalgic Greeks who couldn't accept that their greatest days were behind them. Maybe the library was smaller than the stories claimed, less significant than the legends suggested. Maybe it never existed at all the way people remembered it. And because the scrolls were gone, because the evidence had been reduced to ash and scattered on winds that carried truth away from human memory, we believed them. We let ourselves be convinced that we hadn't lost anything irreplaceable. We accepted that the silence was natural, that the darkness was how things had always been. This was the genius of the erasure, the masterstroke that made it different from ordinary destruction. They didn't just kill the past, they made the present forget it had ever lived, turn a place of light into a legend that couldn't be verified, turn a cultural genocide into a historical footnote that scholars could debate without passion or urgency, turn the murder of humanity's greatest conversation into a bureaucratic adjustment, a correction of overenthusiastic claims, a restoration of realistic perspective, and move on, as if the most tragic loss of knowledge in human history was just a small fire that got out of hand by the docks, as if nothing had really been lost that couldn't be replaced, as if the future hadn't been stolen from every generation that would never have access to what Alexandria had preserved. The war on memory never ends with ashes settling into silence. It never concludes with the last library burning or the last scholar fleeing into exile or the last scroll crumbling into dust. It ends when no one remembers that the ashes existed. It ends when forgetting becomes so complete that people can't even imagine what they've lost. It ends when the absence becomes invisible, when the silence becomes normal, when the darkness feels like the natural state of things. Alexandria didn't fall in a single night of dramatic flames that lit the sky and woke neighboring cities with the smell of burning parchment. It fell in whispers that slowly convinced the world it had never been as bright as people claimed. It fell in edits that revised history until the loss became acceptable. It fell in convenient forgetting that made the present more comfortable. It fell in the gradual acceptance that some conversations can end without anyone mourning their silence. And in that forgetting, in that systematic erasure of what had been lost, the real damage began. Because once you kill memory, you don't need to kill truth. Truth dies on its own, starved of the context that gives it meaning. Once people forget what they once knew, they stop looking for what they've lost. Once they stop looking, they stop finding. And once they stop finding, they convince themselves there was never anything worth looking for. The war on memory always wins in the end. Not through violence, but through the quiet victory of making people complicit in their own forgetting, making them grateful for ignorance, making them afraid of what they might discover if they started remembering. We like to tell ourselves we're different now, smarter than our ancestors who let libraries burn and knowledge scatter like ash on indifferent winds. Safer, because we've learned from their mistakes and built systems that protect wisdom from the darkness that always threatens to swallow light. Too advanced, too enlightened, too aware of history's lessons to let the same tragedies repeat themselves in our more sophisticated age. We point to our digital archives and feel secure. We gesture at our networks of information and call ourselves wise. We count our databases and convince ourselves that knowledge can never be lost again. But look closer, step away from the comfortable glow of screens and the reassuring hum of servers, and you'll see the smoke rising again. Not from burning scrolls whose papyrus screams as it dies, but from vanishing truths that disappear without flame or fanfare, from memories that are deleted rather than destroyed, from wisdom that drowns in oceans of noise. We no longer gather mobs with torches to march on libraries and tear down the temples of learning. We don't need to. We have subtler methods now, more efficient ways of making knowledge disappear without leaving fingerprints or bloodstains that would embarrass future historians. We just stop funding the places where wisdom lives. We let libraries starve slowly, close branch by branch, dismiss librarians like they're obsolete machinery rather than guardians of humanity's memory. We bury facts beneath algorithms that prioritize engagement over truth, popularity over accuracy, comfort over challenge. We drown meaningful signal in endless noise. And the worst part, the most terrifying aspect of our modern destruction of knowledge, We're doing it willingly. We're complicit in our own forgetting. We trade truth for convenience like junkies trading dignity for drugs. We confuse the ability to access information with actual understanding, mistake data for wisdom. Assume that because we can Google something in seconds, we don't need to remember it for longer than it takes to forget we looked it up. We scroll past history like it's just another social media post, giving it the same fleeting attention we give to cat videos and political rants and advertisements for products we don't need. We've built the most comprehensive system for storing and sharing information in human history, and we use it primarily to avoid thinking. We let algorithms decide what we see, what we remember, what we consider important enough to preserve in our minds. We accept that complex truths can be compressed into headlines that fit on phone screens, that nuanced understanding can be replaced by binary choices between predetermined options, that the patient work of learning can be replaced by the instant gratification of having opinions about things we've never actually studied. We've democratized access to information and aristocratized the skills needed to understand it. The Library of Alexandria took centuries to destroy, required armies and mobs, and the accumulated weight of religious and political pressure applied over generations by people who understood they were fighting against something powerful and dangerous. We're accomplishing the same destruction in decades, not through violence, but through voluntary amnesia. Not through conquest, but through the slow surrender of our own curiosity. We don't burn books anymore. We just stop reading them, stop teaching our children how to read them with the patience and attention they deserve, stop believing that the wisdom they contain is worth the effort required to extract it. We don't destroy libraries. We just stop visiting them, stop valuing them, stop fighting to keep them alive when budget cuts threaten their existence. We don't murder scholars. We just ignore them, defund their research, dismiss their expertise as elitist bias that ordinary people are better off without. Civilizations don't collapse in fire anymore, at least not the advanced civilizations that consider themselves immune to such crude forms of destruction. They collapse in apathy. They collapse in distraction. They collapse in the quiet acceptance that entertainment is more important than education, that convenience matters more than truth, that feeling informed is the same as being informed. They collapse when people stop caring about the difference. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building that burned 20 centuries ago in a city whose glory has long since faded into tourist attractions and archaeological sites. It was a mirror. And what it showed us, what it still shows us when we have the courage to look closely at our own reflection, is that knowledge is fragile in ways that transcend any particular technology or storage system. That progress isn't permanent, but dependent on each generation choosing to preserve what the previous generation created. That memory is mortal, vulnerable to the same diseases of indifference and neglect that kill everything else humans care about, only as long as caring costs them nothing. That wisdom can die just as easily from being ignored as from being actively destroyed. We don't know what was lost in Alexandria, and that's the point. We never will. The mathematics that might have unlocked the secrets of the universe centuries earlier, the medical knowledge that might have prevented plagues that killed millions, the philosophical insights that might have taught us to live in harmony instead of constant conflict with each other and with the natural world that sustains us, the technologies that might have given us clean energy before we poisoned the atmosphere, the social innovations that might have prevented wars and genocides and the suffering that still seems inevitable, the artistic achievements that might have elevated human consciousness to heights we can't even imagine, all reduced to silence that future generations will never be able to fill. And maybe, just maybe, when archaeologists of some future civilization sift through the digital debris of our age, trying to reconstruct what we knew and how we lost it, that will be the most terrifying loss of all. Not what they'll find, but what they won't. The silence where our wisdom should have been preserved. The absence where our greatest achievements should have echoed forward through time. Because the pattern is already repeating. The symptoms are already visible for those who know how to read them. We're becoming a civilization that produces vast quantities of information, but very little wisdom. that confuses having opinions with understanding complex truths, that values the ability to access everything while developing the patience to understand nothing, that builds networks capable of connecting every mind on the planet while creating conditions that make meaningful connection nearly impossible. And when the next great library falls, when our databases corrupt, our networks fail, our digital archives become unreadable by technologies that have evolved beyond our current capabilities, it won't be from war. It won't be from religious extremism. It won't be from natural disasters or foreign conquest. It will be from the simple, terrible fact that we forgot stories like this one were warnings rather than ancient history, that we forgot Alexandria wasn't just about the past, that we forgot the smoke in our reflection was telling us we were already burning. We are Alexandria. We are the civilization that could save everything but chooses to preserve nothing. We are the keepers of knowledge who have forgotten why knowledge needs to be kept. And the library is burning again, not in flame, but in our failure to tend the light, not in destruction, but in our willingness to let darkness feel normal. The ghost of Alexandria whispers through fiber optic cables and satellite signals, through the very networks we built to prevent its tragedy from repeating. It speaks in the language of servers that fail without backups, of platforms that disappear overnight, taking millions of conversations with them, of file formats that become unreadable, of websites that vanish like they never existed. It echoes in every moment when we choose the quick answer over the deep question, when we select the simple lie over the complex truth, when we pick the entertaining distraction over the challenging insight, when we mistake the ability to search for everything with the wisdom to understand anything. The scholars of Alexandria couldn't have imagined our world, a place where every human mind could theoretically access the sum of recorded knowledge with a few touches on a screen. They would have seen it as the ultimate fulfillment of their dream. The great library made infinite, accessible to all, preserved beyond the reach of fire or flood or conquering armies. They wouldn't have imagined that we'd use this miracle primarily to argue about things we don't understand, that we'd turn the greatest repository of human knowledge into an echo chamber for our existing beliefs, that we'd use technology that could connect us to wisdom to instead connect us to rage, fear, and the comfortable delusion that complex problems have simple solutions. The real tragedy isn't that Alexandria burned, it's that we built something greater and let it burn anyway, not in flame, but in the slow entropy of not caring, not in violence, but in the gentle violence of distraction, not in conquest, but in the quiet surrender of our own attention. We have become curators of our own forgetting, librarians of our own ignorance, scholars of subjects that don't matter while remaining illiterate in the languages of truth that do. We are both Alexandria and its destroyers. We are the library and the fire. We are the wisdom and its silence. And somewhere in the space between what we could preserve and what we choose to lose, between what we could remember and what we decide to forget, the ghost of the great library watches, waiting to see if we'll learn from its death, or if we'll perfect the art of forgetting it taught, waiting to see if this time will be different, or if the patterns that destroyed it will finally consume us too. In the end, every civilization faces the same choice Alexandria faced: preserve the light, or let it die. Remember the questions, or accept the silence. Choose wisdom over comfort. Choose truth over convenience. Choose the future over the fear of what it might cost. We still have time to choose differently. We still have scrolls left to save. We still have libraries left to tend. But only if we remember that forgetting is not inevitable, that memory is not automatic, that the light only continues burning if someone keeps feeding the flame. The Library of Alexandria is dead. Long live the library. Long live the memory. Long live the choice to remember rather than forget. Long live the wisdom to know the difference. And may we be the generation that finally learns to tend the light instead of feeding the darkness. May we be the ones who remember that every ending is also a beginning, And every silence is also a space where new voices can learn to speak. If we choose to listen, if we choose to remember, if we choose to keep the light burning, even when, especially when, the darkness feels safer, even when, especially when, forgetting feels easier, even when, especially when, the fire feels warmer than the light. The choice is ours. The choice is always ours. The choice has always been ours. Alexandria is waiting. Memory is waiting. The future is waiting for us to decide what we're willing to preserve and what we're willing to lose, and whether this time, finally, we'll choose differently. The ghost of the Great Library holds its breath and waits. So tonight, as you close your eyes, remember the place where knowledge once burned and ask yourself, what are we still losing today, simply because we stopped paying attention? If this story stirred something in you, if the silence of Alexandria echoes in your thoughts, subscribe to MadMinds, where the forgotten is remembered, where lost empires still whisper, and where the ashes still speak. Leave a comment below. What do you think was lost when the library burned? Until next time, keep questioning the shadows and don't let the flame go out again.